Daily Clout. I'm Kate Melgoza, and today I'm joined by State Representative Blasek, and we're going to talk about the very important rule change that was struck down at court in New York. So, Rep. Blasek, thank you for joining us here today.
Yes, I'd love to be on Daily Clout, so anytime.
Perfect. Well, tell us a little bit about this rule change and why it's so important and how it relates to medical freedom and what people can do to educate themselves about it.
Right. So I think the first thing that everyone should understand about government in general is the distinction between rules and law. So laws are created by your duly elected representatives, and they are policy. Now, rules are made by unelected, unaccountable bureaucrats, and they also have the force of law, or I would say the color of law, but they are not supposed to implement policy. They are supposed to be the sort of fine details to enact the policy in the laws that your representatives created. Okay. So, but this is actually where a lot of the tyranny of government sneaks through. All right. I can tell you in my state, the legislature only meets 6 months out of the year. The rule changes often happen in the other 6 months of the year. Bureaucrats like to sneak them through when no one's paying attention. All right. And while they are not supposed to be policy driven, sometimes, frankly, they are. And the problem with that is that the people who created them are unaccountable, right? Because they're not elected people. So this is my big, I am constantly fighting to reduce the administrative state. When people kind of refer to the swamp, it's really not politicians as much as it is the bureaucratic state, okay? Because these are people who, they just sit there forever. And politicians love to create broad laws that have no depth so that the unaccountable people can make the dirty details, okay? Now, this rule change had to do with quarantine and isolation. The state of New York already has laws that spell out quarantine and isolation. I can tell you that quarantine and isolation laws, they don't even just apply to people. They also apply to things, right? So like if you're importing like a food to the state, right, and it maybe is diseased in some way, you would quarantine that. So it applies to things and to people. And in New Hampshire, we've had our quarantine and isolation laws for like, it's in our infectious disease statute. They've been there for way over 100 years, if not longer. But there's a couple concerning things in this particular rule change in New York. Number one, it was very broad and kind of went against policy-wise their already existing law. And it did not really allow for due process. And it allowed for it said that a health officer or health official could remove someone from their home for quarantine and isolation. Okay. So it was struck down in New York on two bases. Number one, that it was policy driven and that the bureaucratic state did not have the authority to enact new policy. And number two, that there was not enough due process. I don't know exactly what the state of New York's original quarantine and isolation laws were as far as due process, but I can say in New Hampshire, if you feel that you were being unfairly isolated or quarantined, you have the right to get before a judge within, I think it's 24 or 48 hours. And all you have to do is sign a already state created form. You just sign the form and you will get before a judge to make your case immediately. That is due process, right? So apparently this rule change did not allow for anything like that. In other words, the state could just come in and say, you know what? I think that you have this disease and you need to be isolated. Oh, and on top of that, I can remove you from your home for quarantine, which is definitely a scary, scary thing. If you have a disease, let's say, I don't know, people always like to throw out the Ebola example, but let's say you have Ebola, right? You certainly have the right to quarantine in your own house until you're no longer infectious. It's not going to be infectious forever, right? So like you should have the right to quarantine in your own house as long as you don't need medical attention. So that's sort of the details of as far as I know about that.
So one of the things that I had been reading about this, and I want to know what your thoughts are on this, is that the New York governor didn't really fight the bill being struck down as much as people were expecting her to. And so I'm wondering if, if she brought in more experts and experts were, agreeing with her, do you think that this rule would have passed where, the government can do all of these things without due process? Or do you think that the outcome would have been the same regardless of how the evidence that she put forward?
I think it would have been the same because I don't think that they didn't actually strike it down based off of the scientific merits, right? It was based off of legal technicalities as far as, rulemaking versus lawmaking, and this idea that everyone has the right to due process. So I don't think it would have made a difference. Also, I mean, what would be the scientific justification for that? If you're again, if you really are infectious and it's a highly deadly disease or whatever, why should you have to be removed from your home? Why can't you just stay away from people in your own house? That's where we're really getting. I mean, this is a fear that a lot of people have, right? We can look at Australia, right? They made these quarantine camps. Canada made these quarantine camps. China, they were separating, children from their parents, right? Removing the children from the home to keep them away from their infectious parents. I mean, these are things that are terrifying to people for good reason. That is an unbelievable amount of government control. And people don't like to bring these sort of elements up, but I will say we actually had some changes made to our rulemaking process, and we did discuss this in testimony in the State House. We have used public health as an excuse to commit atrocities before, right? That was the basis of the persecution against the Jews in Germany. It was actually on the basis of public health, right? They were considered to be a public health hazard. And so, yes, we started removing people from their homes and things like that. So atrocities occur when you start giving up fundamental rights, like lack of due process, for instance. That's a fundamental right, fundamental basis of a free society. So you start giving those things up, yikes.
It's a very slippery slope, I think, especially because I think due process holds people accountable for putting things into action, right? Instead of just saying, I think you have this disease, I'm taking you away from your family and there's nothing you can do about it, type of thing, right?
Yeah, I've had this issue with COVID this entire time. We have always, as a society, operated, right, with this idea, this is part of due process, that you are innocent until proven guilty. We started going down this path anyway with COVID, that you are sick until proven healthy. And yes, that is a very dangerous thing. And I believe a lot of it, and they kind of had to do that, right? They had to convince the public to accept this idea that we are sick until proven healthy, to be able to get them to go along with all of these severe government control mechanisms like lockdowns and mask mandates and vaccine mandates. And it was all predicated on that fundamental lie that they started at the beginning of COVID, that asymptomatic transmission was driving the pandemic, which was just simply never, ever, ever true. I don't know if people are aware of this, but it was all based off of a single anecdotal study from Germany that was immediately retracted, where basically it was like 4 people in Germany who had been in contact with someone from Wuhan, China, who claimed that she wasn't symptomatic, and yet they all got COVID from her, right? And so but it was immediately retracted because it turned out that the researchers never actually talked to the woman from Wuhan, China. When they eventually followed up with her several weeks later, no, she was on a fever suppressant. Okay. She was very much symptomatic. She just covered her symptoms with drugs. Okay. So, but the entire basis of this whole, asymptomatic spread was all predicated on that one study. But they used that and they blew it up because they had to remove this idea that we are innocent until proven guilty to be able to get us all to be fearful enough to go along with all of these measures.
Right. And I think, yeah, I mean, that's a great point. I had no idea that that whole thing about the lady from Wuhan, China. Wow, that's crazy.
It was retracted by, I think, the end of March 2020. And when it got retracted, I started telling everybody about this as if, to me, this was the linchpin to it all, right?
Right.
And everyone just stared at me like, what? I don't understand. What's the big deal? Like, what's the big deal? They're saying that I, who feel perfectly healthy, could be infecting and killing everyone around me. And that's not true. So then why are we locking down? Why are we going to wear masks? I don't understand. No one at the time understood what a big deal that was. And it just sort of went away. But the lie remained.
Right. It's a major fear tactic, I think. And when people are scared, they'll just listen to whoever, I guess, even if that person doesn't have the authority.
This happens with diseases all the time. So I always have an issue with these kind of laws when I'm trying to change them in New Hampshire. They'll always bring up typhoid Mary. Okay. Always, without exception. They bring up typhoid Mary. Now, that's the only example they can ever give because there's like literally never been another notable example of asymptomatic transmission like that. And okay, we're talking like that was a long time ago. Tests were a little bit suspect. She tested positive and negative off and on. She apparently had a very fiery temper, which certainly would have been frowned upon as a woman in the day and age. She was Irish. There was already a lot of stigmas about being Irish and bigotry about that. And so there is some questions about whether that was a real example of asymptomatic transmission or whether this woman was actually a victim of medical persecution.
Interesting. Yeah, that brings up a lot of issues, I think, with the media and kind of propaganda and kind of convincing the population to think one way. So, I mean, is there any tips you would give to someone who, might be, of my generation, maybe, who's a little bit, can be naive watching the news, to keep an eye out for like little things that you see, like this case in New York with the, isolation camps or whatever you want to call them, taking people with no reason, really. Is there any tips you would give to someone, watching things like this play out and trying to understand how this is actually a control game, really?
I'm going to be totally honest. Before COVID, I had never read a law, right, or a rule or anything. But the average person actually can learn how to read laws very easily. I did. It didn't take very much time or any training. Figure out where on your state website. All statutes are public. All rules are public. And I highly recommend that people go and read their infectious disease laws. They're very fascinating reads. You can see a lot of different ideas that have happened throughout history and playing out in the laws. So know your rights. There will typically be a section about due process within the infectious disease laws. And then this is, like I said, the dirty details tend to occur in administrative rules. And rule changes tend to happen when you're, at least in New Hampshire, but I've seen this elsewhere as well, often happen when the legislature is not in session, when people are not paying attention. That's the time to be the most vigilant because they think no one's watching, and bureaucrats are unused to people watching them. So I'll give you a quick example. I have a group that I am the executive director of, Rebuild New Hampshire. These are our issues. We try to watch the calendars for our group, for the people of New Hampshire, watch the legislative calendar, but also watch the administrative rule calendar, okay, when they're going to make these changes. So we noticed back in September of last year that there was a rule change to the vaccine registry. Every state in the country is a vaccine registry. I've talked about this before in Daily Clout, but if you don't know about your vaccine registry, go look it up. This is a huge infringement on your privacy. And every state has one. Some of them are voluntary, some of them are not voluntary. I believe New York's is not voluntary, but you should know whether your state is voluntary or not, because if it is, you want to know how to get out of it, because they were recording everything about your vaccine status. Now, the way our vaccine law is written, you do have the ability to opt out of it, right? So it's voluntary. You can fill out a form and not be in it. They were going to make an administrative rule change last September to change the definition of vaccine. Well, they were going to do a bunch of things. They were going to be able to share that data with way more different types of private businesses. That's what they wanted. That was one of the things they wanted to do. So they were going to sell your data to every entity known to man, okay? And the other thing was they were going to change the definition of vaccine event, okay, to include a refusal of a vaccine. Meaning if you go to your doctor or pharmacy or whatever, and they say to you, do you want your flu shot? And you say, no, thank you. They're going to record that. So you are no longer safe, right? Not in your registry. If you've never received a vaccine, you will be recorded as not being in the registry. So we noticed that rule change, and we packed the hearing. They all have to have a public hearing. They're not used to anyone showing up to these hearings, okay? Because bureaucrats never get watched. We packed it so dramatically. You should have seen them. They were shaking in their boots up there. They eventually canceled the hearing before it even started, saying that the room was getting too overcrowded. And then they canceled the rule change and never tried to do it again. So if you pay attention and you are engaged with your state government, it's actually quite easy to affect change with that. But it takes a lot of vigilance, like I said, bureaucrats especially are not used to people watching them, but honestly, even legislators are not used, state legislators are not used to a lot of attention, and they do bend to pressure pretty easily.
Wow. Yeah, learning a lot of new things. That's great. Thank you for that. And thank you for telling us about all of these things going on in New York, and also just, how we can be on the lookout for things that are infringing on our medical freedom, as well as, our lives in general.
Yes,
Privacy, all of that.
So. Staying engaged at the grassroots level is very important. And that is, you can affect a lot of change. And it's important that we know what's happening in our government, and we don't just allow it to happen to us. And I think if any positives came out of COVID, it's that a lot more people woke up and decided to pay attention to what was happening before. All of these mechanisms for control, they were already in place before COVID started. All they did was pull the levers, right? And I always try to remind people that while it does feel like we took a lot of steps backwards in the fight for liberty in the last 2 years, we actually are in a unique opportunity to attain more liberty than we started with, because we are now aware of where those levers are, and we can start working to dismantle them. So, yeah.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for joining us on our platform, and we look forward to having you back again, of course.
Absolutely. I'm just going to give myself a quick plug. I am running for re-election. I do have a competitive race, and I need donations if anybody wants to help keep the freedom fighters in the New Hampshire legislature. I'm at melissa4 Merrimack.com.
Great. I will put that link below also.
Thank you so much. Donate. All right. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Have a great day.
You too.
Bye.
It's Naomi Wolf of Daily Clout, and I am asking you to please, if you like the video you just saw, support us, become a member, donate. You can send checks to P.O. Box 24, Millerton, New York, 12546, or go to Daily Clout, DAILYCLOUT, become a member or donate. Thank you so much for your support. Every penny goes for paying our hardworking staff, paying hosting costs, and paying our lawyers who have been leading the fight to keep you safe and free, to keep the Constitution safe and to keep you free. Thank you so much.